During the reign of Elizabeth I in the late 16th century, the British Empire began to take shape. Although the Act of Union of 1707 brought Scotland into the fold, strictly speaking, it was the English Empire. Even so, by 1913, the empire encompassed some 400 million subjects at a time when the actual British population was only 36 million. So for 3 centuries, this imperial endeavor was almost unstoppable. Almost, but not quite, as these 10 examples of when the British Empire was defeated in battle show. Minorca, a Mediterranean island off the coast of Spain, was the site of a naval battle in the 7 Years' War between 2 opposing groups of European allies in 1756. 2 of the main protagonists, the British and the French, clashed at the Battle of Minorca. Before the battle, a 13-man British fleet commanded by Admiral John Byng sailed to blockade the French Navy at the Mediterranean port of Toulon. However, a French force of 12 warships had already left the harbor and seized the strategic British base on Minorca. Byng arrived in Minorca waters in May and attacked the French fleet, but his ships failed to engage the enemy effectively. After an inconclusive battle, Byng turned tail and headed for the British base at Gibraltar, handing victory to the French. The admiral was subsequently court-martialed and found guilty of failing to do his utmost against the enemy, either in battle or in pursuit, and sentenced to death, which was carried out on the quarterdeck of the Monarch. A terse entry in the ship's log read, "At 12, Mr. Byng was shot by 6 Marines and placed in his coffin." The Battle of Saratoga, fought about 25 miles, 40 kilometers north of Albany, New York, was a key engagement in the Revolutionary War. The British commander, General John Burgoyne, had marched his force of about 7,500 men south from Canada into New York, with the intention of controlling the Hudson Valley. The Patriot commander was General Horatio Gates, with 8,500 men at his disposal. Arriving at the hamlet of Saratoga in September 1777, Gates ordered his troops to build substantial defenses on the high ground of Bemis Heights above the Hudson River, and the first skirmish occurred on the 19th of September, when a British column, including 500 Hessian mercenaries, advanced on the Patriot forces, but was stopped by a fierce defense. Now pinned down, the British troops began to run out of supplies. On 7th October, in another engagement, a desperate Burgoyne launched an attack on Bemis Heights, but the Patriots decisively repulsed the assault. Hungry and exhausted, the British retreated and were forced to surrender. It was a complete victory for the Patriots, and, crucially, it encouraged the French to increase their support for the Americans. It's 1781, 4 years after the Battle of Saratoga, and the time has come for the final and decisive battle that will end the Revolutionary War and lead to full independence for America. The Siege of Yorktown was a joint land and sea operation by combined American and French forces. In the spring and summer of 1781, a 7,500-strong British force under General Lord Cornwallis was forced to retreat eastwards across America to Yorktown on the Atlantic coast of Virginia. The Patriot Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, quickly realized that the British were effectively trapped and ordered the French commander, the Marquis de Lafayette, to lay siege to the British, and to complete the encirclement of the British, a French fleet of 24 ships blockaded Yorktown. By early October, the French and Americans had partially overwhelmed Yorktown's defenses, and, running out of supplies, Cornwallis surrendered on the 19th of October. It was the final victory in America's fight for freedom. This defeat of a British fleet at the hands of the French particularly angered imperial patriots at a time when the empire liked to boast that it ruled the waves. The loss was all the more bitter, as the man in charge of France was none other than Britain's arch-enemy, Napoleon Bonaparte. The scene of this naval battle of the Napoleonic Wars was the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius, which was used by the French as a safe haven for French privateers who mercilessly harassed British merchant shipping. A British flotilla of 5 frigates under the command of Captain Samuel Pym attacked the Mauritian port of Grand Port. But the French, led by Commodore Guy-Victor Duperrey, mounted a spirited defense. The 36-gun HMS Nereid was forced to surrender after the French onslaught killed 96 of her 281 crew and wounded a further 137. The crews of 2 other British frigates actually set fire to their ships to prevent them falling into French hands. A 4th ran aground on a sandbank, and the 5th also surrendered. As Britannica puts it, the British attack was a fiasco. For this imperial defeat, we move on to the War of 1812, fought between Imperial Britain and America. At the time of this engagement, the war was officially over, but neither side in New Orleans knew it. In fact, a peace treaty had already been signed in the Belgian city of Ghent on Christmas Eve, 1824, a few weeks before the Battle of New Orleans on 8th January, 1815. In the autumn of 1814, around 50 ships of the Royal Navy sailed through the Gulf of Mexico with the intention of attacking New Orleans. When General Andrew Jackson got wind of the British plans, he rushed to defend the city. He mustered a 4,000-strong volunteer army, including Louisiana militia, Choctaw Indians, freed slaves and frontiersmen, and the battle was fought just outside the city at Chalmette Plantation. After several inconclusive skirmishes, the British commander, General Sir Edward Pakenham, ordered his 8,000 troops to launch an all-out attack. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Americans inflicted heavy casualties, including Pakenham himself. They repulsed the attack, ending the British attempt to take New Orleans. It was the last pitched battle between the British and Americans. Afghanistan has famously repelled the armies of 2 world powers in recent times, Russia in 1989 and America in 2021. But it was in the 19th century that the British Empire suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Afghans. Fears of a possible Russian invasion of Afghanistan, threatening the imperial crown jewel of India, had motivated Britain's seizure of the country in 1839. The British imposed an Afghan leader, Shah Shuja, and stationed a garrison of 2 brigades in Kabul. As well as the soldiers, there was a motley crew of civilians, including wives, children, and other camp followers, a total British presence of around 16,000. Shah Shuja proved to have little control over his own people, who rose up against the British and besieged the Kabul garrison. The British commander, General Sir William Elphinstone, had no choice but to negotiate a withdrawal, and in January 1842, a long caravan of troops, baggage, and civilians trudged through the snow over the rugged and unforgiving terrain of the Khyber Pass towards Jalalabad in India. Afghan warriors seized the opportunity to ambush, kidnap, and slaughter these imperial refugees. In the end, only one Briton, Dr. William Brydon, made it to Jalalabad. Isandlwana is located in what is now eastern South Africa. In the 19th century, it was part of the Zulu Empire ruled by King Cetshwayo. In 1878, Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner to South Africa, ordered Cetshwayo to disband his formidable warrior army. This was completely unacceptable to the proud Zulu ruler, and in January 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War began. The first engagement was the Battle of Isandlwana, which stunned the world, according to BritishBattles.com, with some 20,000 Zulus attacking a British force of around 2,000. Though vastly outnumbered, the British force was a well-trained body armed with modern weapons, while most of the Africans carried spears and shields. Appearing on a ridge overlooking the British camp, the Zulus swept down in a massed charge with a central body and two horns designed to outflank the enemy on either side. Cetshwayo's men soon overwhelmed and massacred many of the British soldiers, while many of those who had escaped the initial charge were hunted down and killed. The British lost about 800 men, plus about 500 African auxiliaries. Proving that the First World War was truly a global conflict, this naval battle between Imperial Britain and Germany was fought in the waters off the coast of Chile. When World War I broke out in July 1914, the Germans had a significant naval force in the Pacific under the command of Vice Admiral Reichsgraf Maximilian von Spee. This fleet spent its time harassing British shipping. Royal Navy ships under the command of Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Cradock were in the Pacific to protect merchant shipping and troop ships sailing to Europe from Australia and New Zealand. And on 1 November, German and British squadrons of 4 warships each met near the Chilean port of Coronel. Although he knew the Germans had more firepower, Cradock decided to meet the enemy in battle. A disastrous decision. Von Spee's ships fired on the British, sinking the Monmouth and the Good Hope with the loss of all hands, more than 1,600 men, including Rear Admiral Cradock. Not a single German sailor was killed. By April 1941, the Nazis had successfully crushed Greek resistance and occupied the country. At the time, the British had a substantial garrison on the Greek island of Crete, which lies in the Mediterranean between southern Greece and Egypt. Many of the 40,000 British and Greek troops on the island had been evacuated from mainland Greece in the face of the German advance. Hitler decided that the next step for the Third Reich would be to seize Crete. The Germans had decisive air superiority, but the British commander, New Zealander Major General Bernard Freyberg, could count on strong support from the Royal Navy. Still, defending Crete's mountainous terrain against an airborne invasion would be no easy task. German paratroopers managed to capture Malem airfield, allowing them to airlift in more troops and supplies. This was enough to secure victory after several days of fierce fighting against a poorly organized British force. Some 18,000 British and New Zealand troops managed to escape the island, while 4,000 were killed and 11,000 taken prisoner. Certainly one of the worst military disasters ever to befall the British Empire, the Japanese conquest of Singapore saw the surrender of some 85,000 soldiers. They faced years of forced labor in POW camps notorious for the cruel brutality of their guards. In December 1941, the Japanese swept through the British colony of Malaya, forcing the defenders to retreat south across the causeway to Singapore Island, separated from the mainland by the narrow straits of Johor. Unfortunately, the British strategy for the defense of Singapore had always assumed that the attack would come from the seaward side of the island, rather than from Malaya across the Straits of Johor. The British believed that nobody in their right mind would attempt an attack on Singapore through the seemingly impenetrable jungles and swamps of Malaya. The Japanese, however, completely disproved this assumption. They were able to exploit the poorly constructed defenses to the north of Singapore, quickly overrunning the island and forcing an ignominious British surrender.